Your archaeologist believes he's found the ruins of Noah's Ark.
I would stake my life on the fact that I know where the Ark of the Covenant is.
Okay, we're here in the Ark Discovery studio, and we have a special guest today, Jesslyn Johnson. She's from the Nashville area. And speaking of Nashville, that's where Ron Wyatt lived, wasn't it? Now, how did you first encounter Ron Wyatt in your early days knowing him?
Well, the first time I ever saw him was at church. We used to go to the same church, Sabbath after Sabbath. He and his wife and 3 children, and my husband and I with 2 children at that time, was in the late 60s. And then after that, when I just finished anesthesia training and was working at the old Nashville hospital, he came to the hospital where I was working in General Hospital, Nashville General Hospital.
Okay.
And I happened to be in charge of the anesthesia that day for a few operating rooms, and I was going from room to room to relieve the anesthetist so they could have a break. And there were students from the anesthesia school, Medicine Hospital Anesthesia, School of Anesthesia. And Ron was there. And when I went in to give him a break, he said, "No, I'll finish the case." And I thought that was strange. Nobody had ever not accepted a break before. And then I didn't see him again for a few years, when he came to work where I was working at Donaldson Hospital in Donaldson, Tennessee, which is in the same county as Nashville. And then he worked there for a few years. And that's when we got acquainted. That's when I began to know who he was.
So this was in the early 70s?
Yes, around 1975.
Okay. And that's about the time he started thinking about going out and looking for Noah's Ark, wasn't it? What did he say to you about that?
Well, I understand that from childhood he was interested in exploring and going in caves and finding things. But he started talking about finding Noah's Ark. He wanted to find Noah's Ark. And I didn't have any confidence that he would do such a thing. He told me that there were several things he wanted to do besides finding Noah's Ark. He wanted to check out the Red Sea crossing where the children of Israel went, and several other things. He told me that he had deciphered a
Cuneiform tablet or something?
Cuneiform tablet that had never been deciphered before.
Oh.
And I found that interesting because that takes a smart person to do that.
What was the topic of that? Do you recall?
He didn't say. I was too stupid to ask questions.
No, that's okay.
I didn't do a lot of talking or asking questions in those days. Sometimes I'd like to have the opportunity.
Yeah, go back.
But Ron loved to talk. He would just talk and talk and talk and talk to almost anybody who would listen. And he would talk about things he wanted to do. He wanted to write books. He wanted to make a movie of things from the Bible. He even went so far as to talking about who he would have to play the part of Adam and Eve and such. But he never got his video made. And he didn't get much writing done. He did write some little books, but he tried to find somebody else to write books for him. He wanted to explore and find things. He didn't really want to do the writing himself. He just didn't want to do that, or do the illustrations. He wanted somebody else to help him. And
but let me go back and ask you, so in around 1975 or so, he was thinking about Noah's Ark and even the Red Sea crossing at that point, before he had found anything.
And he was very interested in Egypt. He wanted to explore Egypt. He wanted to, there were just several things that just seemed...
It seemed really big. This is a big task. And no one had found Noah's Ark, no one had found the rest, and yet he was interested in these. Wow, this is amazing.
And I thought, oh, yeah, sure, Ron.
Yeah.
I had no confidence at all that he'd ever do such a thing. But
Sure.
I enjoyed listening. I just loved to hear him talk.
Yeah.
And he loved to talk.
Uh-huh.
And so he told me quite a few things as time went by.
Okay. So, did he talk to you about going out to Noah's Ark, his very first trip? Did he tell you he was getting ready to go or anything like that? Or his return visit?
I think he did talk about it some. He talked about how he didn't know where to go. He wanted to find out from others who had been looking, because lots of people had been exploring in Turkey looking for Noah's Ark, most of them looking on Mount Ararat, which Ron told me that wasn't even there when Noah's Ark landed. He said it was a newer volcanic mountain and that it wasn't there. But he had seen this picture of the Darupanar site, which...
From Life magazine.
Yeah, he wanted to explore. Yeah. And there had been a group, Elder Vanderman's group had gone out there before that and looked it over, and someone had dynamited a hole in the side of it.
1960, yeah.
They were looking for wood with growth rings, and they couldn't find any, so they decided that wasn't Noah's Ark, and they went elsewhere looking. And Ron wanted to go and look at that site, but he couldn't find anybody to tell him how to get there. He did not know where it was.
He interviewed several of them, didn't he? And they couldn't tell him.
I think he tried.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people he actually talked with.
So when he went out there, he just had to say a prayer when they hired that taxi, and God stopped their taxi at 3 different locations. Yeah.
Yeah, they made a pile of stones at each 3 places. The last time, they were losing confidence in that it might be the problem with the taxi and not God stopping it, so they only put 1 stone each in that pile.
Okay, and the last one maybe.
Just,
yeah. So, do you remember him coming back and talking about this trip, or what's one of the earliest discoveries he was telling you about?
Well, he felt sure that site was Noah's Ark, and he wanted to do more exploring. He found drogue stones that he said were tied onto the ark, and that they didn't all come off in the same place. One of the main things I remember from the earlier talks is experiences they had at Dobizet in the hotel that they stayed in.
Yeah.
Because the people weren't really friendly.
Yeah.
He said they tried to rob them. They came to their room, which was on the 2nd floor, I think. And in their escape, they lost some of their film, that some of it was left behind.
Tied some bed sheets together and went out the window.
Yes.
Yeah.
And people were banging on the door and chasing them. At one point they were running and someone was chasing him, and Ron grabbed a person and beat up on him.
It was a soldier.
He was a soldier?
Yeah.
From the,
Danny Ronnie told me that.
He was not one of the people that were trying to rob him.
No.
But it was dark.
Yeah.
And you couldn't see and
Yeah.
just. But he spent the time in the, was it the police station?
They went
after that playing a card game
they went to
or something
the
in
soldiers' headquarters there. Yeah, and played cards with them there or whatever. They thought it was funny that this old man had taken down both of them, these two soldiers that kind of came after the three of Ron and his two sons, and they were laughing. This old man had taken them out. But, yeah. So, okay.
Ron said, I cleaned his clock.
Yeah. So he came back and told of that exciting experience, and then just the next year in '78, he went to the Red Sea crossing. Did he talk to you about that, the early years?
Yes, he talked about how so many people read the Bible and they think that the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea at the Gulf of Suez. But that's a very shallow place, and it doesn't really fit with the Bible story. And he said nobody had ever found artifacts there in all these years. Ron was quoting Galatians 4:25, saying that it says Mount Sinai in Arabia. And he had read in another place about Moses fleeing from Egypt and fleeing toward Arabia. And he said, I would like to go take scuba diving lessons so that I can dive in the Gulf of Aqaba, because if Arabia is where Moses was going to, it would have to, the crossing site would have to be the Gulf of Aqaba and not the Gulf of Suez. And Ron was reading his Bible a lot, and he really trusted his Bible, and he started looking for a place for scuba lessons. And so when he signed up for the scuba lessons, sometimes, well, he and his sons both, and Michelle, all taking scuba diving lessons together, starting out in a swimming pool and then going on from there. He asked me to come and cover for him when his lessons were scheduled on days he had to work. So on those days, he would call me from home, and I would go to the hospital and stay there until his scuba diving lessons were over. Then he'd come and relieve me, and I would go back home. And shortly after getting his license, and I have a copy of his scuba license.
Oh, okay.
He came back from a trip from the Gulf of Aqaba, scuba diving, with a horse hoof and let me hold it. And I thought that was exciting.
Yeah. And there's no horses in the Sinai Peninsula, so that had to be from Pharaoh's army.
Couldn't have come from a camel.
Yeah, right. Sure, so that's exciting.
And then he would go on other trips. Oh, he told me that he went down 205 feet, but that he couldn't stay down but 5 minutes because there was so much pressure. He had to get back up. And he told me about finding chariot parts, chariots without wheels and wheels without chariots, and horse bones and human bones. And he would make another trip, and he would come back and say, Jesslyn, I found another pile of human bones. And he'd make another trip and come back and say, Jesslyn, I found another pile of human bones. But there were people who were saying, oh, Ron just planted those things. It wasn't for real. but there was coral growing on a lot of things, and that takes a long, long time.
That's right.
And there is no way that Ron could have set that up.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So, and then another discovery was going over to Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. That was 1984. Do you recall Ron being taken prisoner at that time? Were you working with him at that time in 84?
Yes. I remember, I don't remember the exact date, but I was at work. He was supposed to come and relieve me, and he didn't show up. And I kept looking out the window to if I could, so I could see where his car was being parked if he ever came. And I looked, and I never did see him, and I had to stay over and over and wondering what happened to Ron, and I did not know that he was still in Saudi Arabia.
My, okay. So he spent 76 days in prison there, unjustly, being accused of being a spy. Now Ron was taken in prisoner in a way, or kidnapped in Turkey. This was 89 or 90 by some PKK Turkish rebels, and it was over 2 weeks or so. They were being hiked through the wilderness there in the mountains, and Ron said he almost died. So you recall anything about that incident, or?
He talked about that. It's been a long time since I thought much about it. But he told me that he had been to Turkey, and he thought they were going to give him a permit to excavate it, that he had wanted so badly to excavate that. I would see him drawing on paper what he would like to do, because he didn't want to destroy it as it was being dug into. And at one point he thought it would be best to have a glass covering over it. And he was making drawings for a glass covering from one end to the other. He said he thought it would be best to build this glass covering first, and then start excavating down one end of it and make a place to go down and through the entire ark and up out the other side. And then maybe people could come and view the animal pens that were on each side.
Walk through the bottom of the ark, yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So Ron used a lot of his own money to do all this work, didn't he? I mean, he would work a month or two, then go overseas for a month or two. Is that correct?
He did that for a time. There was a time he had, if he wanted more time off, he would have to trade days at work so that he could have more days off together. Because, well, one time he stayed on the job in the delivery area for a week.
A week?
A week, so that he could get 3 weeks off to go do exploring.
Wow. And
that didn't sit too well with with I guess him and others until he, well, at one point he was being given donations. And some people gave him tithe money, and doctors would give him money. Different people would give him money for making the trips. And then at one point he came into some money that he used for trips. And then he quit working where I was working, though I would still see him. I mean, he quit working for the hospital where I was working.
Okay.
And he would do freelance work some at another hospital, just part-time when they needed an extra anesthetist. One hospital after another. Sometimes he'd be working at 2 or 3 different, 4 different hospitals, you know, a little here and a little there.
Yeah.
And he would work when he wanted to, so that he was free to go do all this exploring. That was just his life, is doing the exploring.
Yeah.
And he went to country after country I don't know how many countries he actually did exploring in. I know he did a lot in Egypt as well as Israel, from one end to the other, and Jordan and Turkey.
So he made like 130 some odd trips overseas working with the Discoveries. That's just amazing. And so
Very many.
he may have spent $1 million of his own money during this 22 years dedicating his life to this, his last 22
probably
years.
At least.
Yeah.
Probably more.
Yeah. That's amazing. And yet some critics will say he's into this for fame and money.
Oh, no.
Money, he lost money, you could say, working with the Discoveries, but he gained God's favor by this work.
There were times when he was over there and doing the work. One time, somehow, he lacked $300, having enough to pay his hotel bill. And someone came to him with three
they were
torn,
damaged,
beat up $100
$100 bills.
Say,
Wasn't that amazing?
Will you take these home and exchange them for new ones and bring them back to me? And he says, yes, I will be glad to. And he went and paid his hotel bill.
Yeah.
And then brought money back to the man
The
when
next
he came
trip.
on his next trip.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And there was another time, I know, he said, when he was working out in the wilderness, and I didn't know for a while what he meant. Like I said, he explored Israel from one end to the other, and he was working, I don't know, and he found a lot of artifacts and turned them in to the Antiquities Department and others. He said that there were places that he worked where he couldn't get good food to eat, and sometimes he had to work just with bread and cheese because he was a vegetarian. There just was no place else to eat.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't all honey and roses.
That's right.
He really paid. Ron ended up paying with his life. He gave his all. He gave everything he had, everything for this work.
Exactly. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So then he talked to you at some point about finding the Ark of the Covenant. What was that like?
Well, he first told me about, he had never talked to me about finding the Ark of the Covenant at the time that he was wanting to find Noah's Ark and the other things. He never mentioned that. In fact, he told me he hadn't even thought of it. And the first thing was that he was sunburned from scuba diving and was walking in the garden tomb, and his hand pointed out and said, that's Jeremiah's grotto, and the Ark of the Covenant is in there. And it was like, why did my mouth say that?
That's amazing.
He said he hadn't even thought of it. And the person from the Antiquities Department there said, well, great, you excavate and we'll furnish you things. And Ron said that he knew that was supernatural, but he didn't know if it was the good or the bad, and then he needed to go home and think about it and study up on it. He said he had no idea why the Ark of the Covenant could possibly be in that place that looked like a dump where there were a couple of dead cats on it. He said that just was startling to him. He had no idea about that before. So he went home and later went back and started digging, and he and the boys dug and I was wondering what was taking so long, and why was he spending so much money to go and not, when he'd come back, he still hadn't found it. Trip after trip after trip, Still hadn't found it, but he had interesting things to say. And then one day he said, Jesslyn, I found the hill outside Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified. And I thought, wonderful.
Yeah.
And then another time he said, that he had found the cave. He had found, he said, the Ark of the Covenant is in a cave under the crucifixion site. And I said, what did you come back to work to relieve me for? Why don't you go back and watch it? Somebody's going to come and take it over.
Yeah.
He said, oh, it's well guarded.
Sure.
Because I had no idea. You know, in my mind, I couldn't picture the
Right.
reality at all.
Yeah.
And then he told me something else, just a little about it. He said, I'm not supposed to talk about it. Don't you tell anyone, or they'll kill me. He didn't tell me who they were.
Yeah.
He said, I've been told that if I tell about it, they would kill me or my family, and they have ways of knowing. So don't you tell this.
Yeah.
And so I didn't for years.
The Israel Antiquities Authority had threatened him not to say where it was. Yeah. So, under a death threat. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So at some point he talked about the blood on the mercy seat. Do you recall the first time you heard about that?
That I will never forget as long as I have breath in my body.
Yes.
That affected me so much more than anything else I had ever seen, heard, or did in my life. That affected me. It changed my life.
Sure.
It really did. Because that was something that I had wanted to know and could not find out at all. Do you want me to tell anything about that, or?
Yeah. So what did he tell you specifically about that? About his encountering the angels taking the sample of blood? Did he talk to you about that, or?
Yes, but that came later.
Okay.
That was quite a while.
Yeah.
Later. Because of how it affected me, the reason, and Ron had no idea. I was born in Missouri to parents who didn't go to church regularly for a long time. My father joined the church when I was 5, and then we moved to where there was a church, and I started going to church school, and we had Bible classes. And in the Bible classes, I learned about Samuel and Eli and the golden candlestick, and then I learned there was a picture of the tomb where Jesus was put, and I loved seeing that. But for 2 years, when I was 9 and 10, the same Bible book was used for the classes, and I got a double dose about the sanctuary and the temple sacrifices, and that was very interesting. But it posed a problem for me because of when the animals had to be killed and the blood taken in the sanctuary and the blood sprinkled. Lambs were blood sprinkled, and then on the Day of Atonement, the bull and the goat's blood sprinkled on the mercy seat. And there were other sacrifices, and I understood that all of the sacrifices were to point forward to when Christ would come and God would present his lamb to the world, sacrifice him to cover for all those sacrifices. And my thought was, two of the priests in the sanctuary were killed because they did something wrong. Well, God was God and he could do anything he wanted to do. But when it came his turn to do his sacrifice, it didn't look to me like he did it right. Because he hung his lamb on the cross and let him bleed to death. But did he ever apply the blood to the mercy seat or anywhere in the sanctuary?
When were you thinking about this? What age were you?
9 and 10.
That's amazing.
And I was so timid, I didn't ask the teacher. And I knew my parents wouldn't know. I didn't know how to study the Bible by myself. And I listened and listened and listened to all the sermons at church and at the tent meetings and wherever, hoping for an answer. And I never did hear anybody mention it. And I wanted to know so badly, but I didn't know how to find the answer. And I figured that if the blood of Jesus was not put on the mercy seat, then my sins couldn't be forgiven.
Yeah.
And that worried me so. I needed to know if the blood was there, but I had no way of knowing. And I'm like, I wanted to go to heaven, but the blood had to be on the mercy seat for me to go. And if it wasn't there, why should I bother to be a good girl if I wasn't going to get to go to heaven? And I wanted that answer, and I couldn't get it, and it bothered me for years. Gradually, I forgot about it, because God had answered some of my prayers, and he was good to me. He even performed some miracles for me. And I knew he loved me. So I figured I'd better trust in him and trust that he did completely fulfill his sacrifice, and that I couldn't know for sure, but I just shouldn't worry about it because God was good, God was love, and so I just let it go.
Yeah.
Until
Ron
set the bomb off. He came to work and he said, well, it's strange. I relieved him and he was leaving, and he at the door he turned around and came back like he was going to say something. I enjoyed listening to him talk, but he didn't seem talkative this morning at all. And he came back towards me, then he turned around and started leaving again, and then stopped and turned around and took a step or two toward me, and he didn't say anything, and I'm like, what is wrong with Ron? He was the talker. I mean, anybody who would listen, he would talk. And
he was doing some thinking.
What's going on with Ron?
Yeah.
It startled me. And then he came back the third time. He came back and he walked really close to me. And he stood there and he just stared at me, and I'm like, this is really weird. And then he stepped closer, and he was kind of looking in my eyes, like, and I'm like, what is going on? And so I was just standing still, but then I turned my head and looked up at his eyes, and then he said, Jesslyn, the blood of Jesus fell on the mercy seat, and that's when our sins were forgiven. I never heard another word, if he ever said another word. And I was just instantly so affected, it was like in a vision. I couldn't see Ron. I got real stiff. It was like totally stiff. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I couldn't feel my heart beating. And I could like see myself in the basement of that church school, in the schoolroom, as a 9 or 10-year-old girl with a very sad face, wondering if God put the blood on the mercy seat so my sins could be forgiven. And it just affected me so. I know I'll never forget that. And then I was like back in Tennessee in the room with Ron, but I still couldn't move. I couldn't move myself. I couldn't focus my eyes. I had no idea how much time had passed. And then I could see a little, but just I couldn't move my eyes. From the periphery of my eyeballs, I could see Ron tiptoeing out the door.
Yeah.
And I wanted so badly to say, don't leave me alone like this. Don't leave me. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And then Ron was gone. He was like slumped over, tiptoeing out the door. I had no idea. I wasn't able to see when he left from being in front of me. And we never talked about it later.
Really?
I was in such a state of shock that I could not have gone to work if they had called me. I was on call. My phone never rang for about 8 hours. I couldn't have handled it.
Amazing news. Yeah. It all makes sense, the blood going on the mercy seat.
So no, I will never forget that part.
Yeah. Wow. Now, Jesslyn, you wrote a song about the most holy place. Of course, the most holy place today is this cave with the Ark of the Covenant, or the most holy in it. The Ark of the Covenant is in that cave, and today that cave is the most holy place, isn't it?
Well, it would be the most holy place on earth.
Yeah. And you wrote a song about it. And I'm going to play it here. Let's watch it here, and you can make some comments about it.
When Jesus